Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Farmer. I am an arts reporter for Georgia Voice here in Atlanta. I also coordinate Out on Film, Atlanta's LGBTQ Film Festival. I am so excited about this next interview. The new docuseries Disco Soundtrack of a Revolution is a three-part docuseries which begins on PBS June 18th at 9 p.m. I've watched roughly about half of it. It is phenomenal. I'm so excited for everyone else to begin watching it. And I'm so excited to have two of the principals behind this. We have one of the overall directors, Grace Chapman, and we have the director of episode 3, Shianne Brown. Thank you so much for making this, and thank you so much for talking to me today.
You're
Thank
very
you for having
Thanks
us.
for the interview. Yeah.
Again, when I started to watch this, like there's just so much detail there and so much I didn't know, and so many great interviews and such a great, trajectory of how it started, why it started, when it reached its peak, and there's just so much there. I cannot wait to finish this. But I guess my first question for both of you is, what made both of you interested in doing this?
Oh, wow. Shall I go for that?
Yeah.
I think we came to this and, disco, people have got this image in their head what disco is.
Yeah.
And for people who maybe have looked at it a bit more in depth, we all knew that wasn't the true story and it wasn't getting out there, that it wasn't just Studio 54. So
Exactly.
from an intellectual and artistic perspective, that's what captivated me about doing this subject. But from a personal perspective, I grew up at a time when I remember sort of disco, Saturday Night Fever. I'm genuinely old enough that my parents ran a dance studio and did disco lessons. And where I grew up, that was one of the unifying factors because I grew up in Belfast and there were lots of violence and, a war going on. But people got on the dance floor and they forgot their troubles. So I wanted to reinvestigate that as an adult, what that meant, why people find solace and liberation on the dance floor. So for me, I had a dual reason for doing this, but you, Cheyenne, go for it.
I think for me, I've always been a fan and a lover of disco. And I think disco music in itself, you can think about the commercial artists and the artists who have, created an impact and a legacy of disco. But I really wanted to unpack the socio-economic, political landscape of that genre and that movement. And so looking at that intersection between the music and the politics is what really drove me to this project, because I think there's so many avenues for the audiences to learn about disco, where it came from, the legacy of it today, and how we can really honor those voices and celebrate those voices of expression and freedom. So yeah, that's in a nutshell of what drew me to the project.
Okay, great. Can both of you talk a little bit briefly about the time period in the early 70s when disco had its first beginnings and all that was going on during that time? There was a lot going on during that time.
There was a lot going on. I think it's one that's had, for people, it might seem that it's a long time ago, but we've had our own mirror image recently with the economic collapse, and how people have gone out and created art in warehouses recently. It's happening all around where I live in Hackney. It's happening around where you live in Peckham. We in London. These places are full of creatives going, we've got no money, we haven't got the opportunities that perhaps were there for previous generations. But we're not gonna be ground down by it. We're gonna go off and make our own life. So in America, particularly, at that period on the East Coast, there was so much economic deprivation and there was so much oppression of minority communities that they were never going to succeed within the mainstream. If you were queer, Black, Latino, a woman, you just weren't getting a chance in the United States that was overseen by Nixon and that was sort of still reeling from the Vietnam War. And you just went out and you made your own life because you wouldn't be accepted. Well, you were going to create a world where you were accepted and which you loved, and that didn't have to be shaped by those you know, the structures and authority. So I suppose, I mean, is that a little bit woolly? I could go into more detail, but I think that's the landscape that people were operating in. And, you know, New York, people were being driven out and priced out, and ghettos were being created. And people stepped into the ghettos and they said, you might not want to be here, but we do. And we're going to take it and make it beautiful. And they did.
Exactly.
And just to add to that point, Grace, I think, yeah, you covered everything, but, you know, something that you just said, which sparked a thought in my mind, is that out of oppression always tends to come amazing art. And I think we've seen that throughout history, over the decades, where you see people who are disenfranchised, who are marginalized, they create magic and they create something DIY and incredible. And I think, you know, the series as a whole really represents that ethos and that message.
Yeah, and if I can pick up from what you're saying, I think that's why it's important that we see the landscape at the beginning. You know, there was a void, and into that void, an explosion of color. But it continues all the way through. So very much in the episode 3 that Shianne did, you know, you're talking about a decimated landscape, you know, a racist landscape, a homophobic landscape, and into that, were people going to be oppressed? No, they were going to yet again create another slice of magic. They're going to take it on. If you're going to steal what they have created, if you're going to appropriate that and turn it into something that becomes hollow and commercialized, well, we're taking it back and we're taking it in a new direction. And I think, you know, you talk about that, that's beautifully represented in film 3.
Mm.
And what Honey Dijon mentioned in my episode is, you know, dance floors do what countries and governments can't. You know, they unite people. When you're on that dance floor and you're listening to disco and you're in this culture, it doesn't matter who you are, where you've come from, we're going to unite here under a disco ball and the good vibes of the music.
One of the things the series does really well is it shows how disco emerged from a basic desire for inclusion, visibility, and freedom among persecuted Black, gay, and minority ethnic communities of New York City. And that's just fascinating just to see, you know, I mean, to see beginnings of it and how it really grew from there, and how this music really truly brought people together.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the most fascinating parts, and you've watched episode 1, but is how, and it's not just Nicky Siano. So Nicky Siano is obviously the godfather of disco. But when he starts to say, well, look what was happening in the Stonewall, that was one of the few dancing bars.
Exactly.
Disco grew out of that desire to dance together, where from the people who were told they weren't allowed to be in the public spaces. And I just love that, how it did just grow organically from the need to dance.
Yeah. Can another question, can either one of you talk a little bit about the new generation of DJs and musicians who kind of pioneered that distinct sound and sort of emerged during that time, those early days?
Well, the early days would very much be, I mean, we all take our hats off to Nicky Siano, who, you know, ran the gallery, who just really was groundbreaking in a lot of ways. But prior to Nicky, there was David Mancuso, who's seen as when people talk about disco and its history, you have to go to the loft. You have to look at the fact that this man opened his doors and said, come in here and dance and drink from the drink from the doctored urn, which was laced with LSD. And you know, and that was a place of inclusivity, specifically from the outset. So Dave Mancuso, there's Nicky, don't know, there are just so many other people who run different clubs that it's hard to name check everyone. But I think for me, those are the two who stand out, and we tried to focus on them because I think it's agreed that they stood out, and they did help generate the next generation of DJs. They helped create this system that never really had been there before. You know, there's a great interview with David Morales in there, who talks about going to the loft, and Nicky himself taught Frankie Knuckles how to DJ, and Larry Levan. It's like, so all these little tendrils that grew out, and people who became great, like Larry Levan and Frankie Knuckles, and became world changers in their own right. They all, everybody could trace the roots probably back to David Mancuso. Would you say so, Shianne?
Yeah, totally. And you know, that new generation that David Mancuso and Nicky Siano created was, you know, Larry Levan, who's very present in episode 3. You know, he learned a lot from David Mancuso and Nicky. And what's remarkable and interesting about Larry Levan is, you know, the remixes, and then how remixes have just evolved over time when, you know, house music comes about with the disco pioneers in Chicago, with Frankie Knuckles, and we get that today. You know, the remixes are so important within contemporary music. And so the roots can all start, you know, from those early loft parties at David Mancuso's.
Exactly. By the time we moved to the second episode in the mid 70s, that was sort of the high watermark of disco. It had entered the mainstream. It turned Black women and gay men into superstars and icons. It was the birth of the disco diva, from Gloria Gaynor to Donna Summer and Thelma Houston. Can you talk? I mean, great. I mean, Shane, can you talk a little bit about, you know, the segue into the mainstream, and some of those people who really influenced and were part of that?
I think, you know, what's remarkable. So I was very privileged enough to interview Anita Ward and Candy Staton. And what was really interesting about those two women is they would talk about how, you know, the music industry would often push them to be R&B singers. That was their role as Black women. You need to be an R&B singer. And what disco did, it allowed them to branch out from that box. And, you know, Candy was like, I loved that life. I would go to Paradise Garage and Studio 54, and I'd be amongst all of these people who would just love me and love what I represented. And I think that segue, you can look at it in two different ways. That was the moment where, you know, it got oversaturated. There was the same sound that was dominating the music industry, but at the same time, it provided a sense of success and, you know, branching out of those stereotypes for a lot of people. So I think you can look at it in both ways, but I think when you speak to a lot of the artists, like, you know, Anita Ward and Candy Staton, I think they look back at that time really fondly, and it was a time of celebrating them and who they were.
Yeah, and I think we have to absolutely acknowledge how trailblazing they were. I mean, if we look at Gloria Gaynor, who was the first person crowned the Queen of Disco, I mean, she was the first disco superstar, you know, the first person who went out there and was the singer who hit the top of the charts, first woman, first Black woman disco diva. And, you know, that woman, you know, she went through everything, and you've got her from the beginning where she's only heralded in the underground clubs to the time when she's making I Will Survive, and you've got the commercialization that Shianne's talking about, and nobody's really wanting to listen to her as an artist. They're saying, oh, this track, we're going to put out this, I can't remember the name of it, but it was like this really inferior track, and she was like, no, I Will Survive, that's the one, you have to play I Will Survive. Nobody would listen to her. She took that track herself and went to the DJ booth and said, ignore the other side, play I Will Survive. You know, these were artists. They weren't just puppets.
Exactly.
They knew their onions. So.
Grace, a little bit earlier, you said you did not want to make this just a rehash of Studio 54. And thank you. I mean, not to diminish the you know, Studio 54 and its importance, but there is a whole lot more to this story than Studio 54. Can you sort of talk about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose we've talked a lot about the origins of disco, and disco's actually quite eclectic. And I think by the time we get to Studio 54, it becomes, so it was eclectic and inclusive. Okay, and the inclusivity is really important. And you get to Studio 54 and it becomes exclusive. It becomes something that only the in crowd are allowed, and Studio 54 becomes about being seen rather than being part of the whole, being part of the swelling mass of bodies where you can lose yourself on the dance floor, where you're not going to be singled out, you're not going to be discriminated against. It becomes a place where you just want the camera to be pointed at you. And I think there's a great story that Nikki Siano told about DJing in Studio 54 one night, and it's full of the excess, and he comes out and there's a guy on the street begging for $1 who's got nowhere to go. And for Nikki, that was a really pivotal moment in going, whoa, things are starting to get out of whack here. It's getting out of kilter. So I think that's why it was important for us. It's just like, let's rebalance. Studio 54 is incredible. There was so much performance out there. It's such an important time. But disco wasn't just about little Coke spoons and moons. It was much more than that.
Exactly. Shianne, by the time we get to the final episode, that final episode does document, I'm reading from the precedents, the wellspring of resentment from white, straight, male-dominated, rock-loving middle Americans as they targeted disco for its hedonism, femininity, and queerness. How did disco get to that point?
I think there was a lot of backlash with, rock fans. They would turn on the radio and they could no longer listen to the music they wanted to listen to. And I think the oversaturation and the commercial success of disco angered a lot of people who saw disco as the antithesis of who they were and what Middle America is and should be. And so we delve into the disco demolition, which, Steve Dahl, the radio disc jockey, organized an event where people and rock fans would bring a disco record and they would destroy it. And, it's very sinister. It has very sinister undertones. It's quite obviously anti-Black, gay, Black and brown communities. And it feels violent, but disco represented the opposite of what rock represented. And I think it was a backlash against the people, not necessarily the sounds, because people didn't necessarily bring disco records. There were a lot of just Black artists who people would bring to destroy those records. And so I think it was a culmination of a lot of things and people not willing to be progressive and move on. And I think disco represented society changing, and I think that was quite antagonistic towards a lot of the rock fans.
Okay, I got one or two more questions and we're going to wrap up. Can you talk about how the pioneers of that time and later have managed to keep disco going and still alive today, and why it matters?
Oh, wow. Why disco matters. Come on, you're out there dancing, Jim, aren't you? It's well, I think this is something that Shianne covers really well in the third episode, about how we've just talked about what happened at Comiskey Park, but it's important that is not the death of disco. It's just the rebirth of a different type of dance music. It might no longer have that name of disco, but it's evolved from it. So Shianne, if you want, we can go into Chicago and the house scene there, but I don't know if you want to just talk about how it was taken on post Comiskey.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about Comiskey Park is that it happened in Chicago, and Chicago became the birthplace of house music. Yeah. And it was those New York pioneers like Frankie Knuckles and Robert Williams who set up, you know, the warehouse, which is where house music comes from. And it was, you know, Frankie Knuckles learned from Larry Levan, who then learned from Nicky Siano. And so we see the links, you know, going through the times. And yeah, again, the same thing happened with house music. You know, people don't really know the history, you know, because we have superstar DJs, you know, no shade to Calvin Harris or, you know, those kind of big superstar DJs. But I think a lot of people don't realize, again, that house music's roots are in Black and brown and marginalized LGBTQ plus communities. So I think it's just really important just to circle back, you know, that we always understand the origins of a culture that we enjoy the fruits of.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really important, that we have Beyonce recently sort of giving the shout outs. It's let's give respect to the pioneers always.
Exactly. This isn't a question, just a comment. The interviews in this series are amazing. And thank you again for making this. And thank you. I'm sure, you know, especially, you know, I'm glad this is being shown, especially during Pride Month. I'm sure people are gonna love this. I'm so very excited for other people to watch it and to finish this myself. Okay, Disco Soundtrack of a Revolution begins on June 18th on PBS. It can also be found at pbs.org, the PBS app, and PBS Passport. Thank you so much, Grace. Thank you so much, Shianne, for taking time to talk to us. And congratulations on this series.
Well, thank you for
Thank you, Jim. That was great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Have a great rest of the day. And
happy Pride again. Happy Pride.
Thanks so much.
All right. Bye. Bye.